A Tiger in the Zoo by Leslie Norris. He stalks in his vivid stripes the few steps of his cage, on paths of velvet quiet in his quiet rage. A Tiger in the Zoo by Leslie Norris. UK actually has 4 parts: England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. England, of course, English poetry we keep talking about all the time. Maybe some of you know Ireland because you know people like George Bernard Shaw, or probably you know the great poet W.B. Yeats. When I come down to Scotland, some of you might have read poems by Robert Burns, and you may recall that even the spelling of the words is very different from the English we use. But today we are looking at a poet, a Welsh poet. That means coming from Wales. The earliest Welsh poetry written in the English language probably began by around the 6th century and in the bardic tradition. You find hymns which were written later, and modern Welsh poetry is supposed to have begun around 1600. Other names that you might want to look up would be Anne Griffith or Waldo Wilhelm. 1921 to 2006. A fellow of the Royal Society in Literature, Leslie Norris is a Welsh poet, a short story writer too. Professionally, was a lecturer and a headmaster. For a short while, Leslie Norris served in the Air Force too, and strangely seems to be better known in USA than in England. A very interesting kind of poetry that they wrote, the language, is Con Haneth. Yeah, doesn't sound English, so maybe I could spell it for you. Cynghannedd, but pronounced Con Haneth. It's a kind of sound arrangement within one line, which uses stress, alliteration and rhyme. So let's see what the poet has to say about a tiger in the zoo. A Tiger in the Zoo. The title makes it very clear to us that we are looking at this wild animal in the zoo. Not many of us have probably been lucky, or should I say unlucky, if we are scared of them, to see a tiger in the wild. Here in the zoo we feel very comfortable because we are very, very sure that we are safe because the tiger is within the cage. But what does the poet feel about it? This poem addresses a very simple theme, a theme that we need to think about, which is freedom versus captivity. There's a beautiful poem by Keats which some of you could go back and read. I had a dove, and I kept the dove in a cage, and I fed it with my own hands, and I tied a silken thread, yet why did it want to die? Anyway, that's about a dove, and here we are talking about a tiger. He stalks in his vivid stripes the few steps of his cage. That's how the poem begins. What a sad, sad picture it gives us of this great tiger. And when he stalks, when he walks, it lives in areas, the Sundarbans in India, for example, lives in areas where the grass grows very tall. So the stripes of the tiger and the tall grass, it's a perfect camouflage for it. And he walks there. The skin, his skin, the tiger skin, is soft, satin, velvety. Imagine. I've never touched one. I'm only imagining from what the poet describes for us. Velvet quiet is what he says. And is the tiger happy being inside? The poet imagines no. Some of you might have heard the roar of the tiger too. How is he? In his quiet rage. Is that okay to have the tiger here within the cage? He should be lurking in the shadow, sliding through long grass, near the water hide, where plump deer pass. Again, a beautiful image, because you can think of the tiger chasing a deer, though our heart is with the deer and we hope it escapes, but really the tiger too needs its food. So it's there near a water body with tall grass and waiting probably to pounce on its prey, the deer. He should be snarling around houses at the jungle's edge, baring his fangs, his claws, terrorizing the village. We constantly talk about how we have encroached upon wild land, the land of wild animals. And we have heard stories of how a tiger, a lion, some wild animal entered the village and carried away maybe a buffalo or a goat or sometimes even a dog. So the poet thinks that the ideal place for the tiger to be should be when it's lurking around villages. And think of its claws. You must have seen the claws of the tiger. You must have seen the teeth with which it can probably tear to pieces an animal. But that's where he should be. But is he there? No, in our poem, because remember, it's a tiger in the zoo. So what is he doing? But he is locked in a cell. Isn't that sad? And he pretends we don't exist, the visitors. The tiger doesn't care about us. Sometimes we hear the sound of the tiger near the village. But what does the tiger hear here? The patrolling cars. Because there are cars which come around to make sure that the animals inside the cages are safe. A sad picture indeed of a wild animal caged by human beings for their own pleasure. I've always believed that reading a poem before explaining the poem is very, very important. But once I've read the poem, my students have read the poem, then we talk about maybe the theme. And having talked about the theme, the next thing that we all do is to move on to figures of speech. Every poet has his own favorite figures of speech. But something which is interesting in this poem is probably not a very, very common figure of speech, but you might have heard of, and that is oxymoron. An oxymoron is when we place next to each other two opposite words. For example, can we talk about ugly beauty? Can we talk about kind cruelty? Now these are oxymorons. So here there is a beautiful oxymoron when he talks about the quiet rage. Rage is anger. Anger has to be expressed, but here it is kept within. It does not roar, it does not frighten the visitors. Remember, it doesn't even bother to look at us. So the poet uses a beautiful oxymoron, quiet rage. There is repetition. One may ask, what does repetition achieve? Remember, when the poet wants to emphasize something, then repetition is used. A very simple figure of speech, but it is there. And you can notice here the word brilliant, right? The poet is trying to tell us something when he repeats the word brilliant. There is personification, which you have probably come across in many earlier poems, where the tiger is now imbued with. The tiger is given very human qualities. Again, not a very common one, but which you've probably come across in earlier poems, is the synecdoche, where one part stands for the whole. So when he talks about stripes, he's actually referring to the tiger. A tiger in the zoo. We've looked at the tiger as we know, most of us know, having seen wild animals in the zoo. But there is another very famous poem by William Blake. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you've read other poems. Tiger, tiger, burning bright. What a beautiful poem. Of course, that poem is also philosophical, but I think you should read it also for what he tells us about the tiger. So it might be a good idea to read other poems about the tiger, maybe other wild animals, maybe other animals if you have favorite animals like a dog or a cat. Read Eliot's poems on the cat, T.S. Eliot's poems on the cat. Amazing. You could read Lear, for example, some of his poems, Edward Lear. He calls it nonsense verse, but it's much more than nonsense verse. And of course, you have now been introduced to Welsh poetry. So it may not be a bad idea to look at other Welsh poets and see whether it is different from the English poetry you are familiar with. He hears the last voice at night, the patrolling cars, and stars with his brilliant eyes at the brilliant stars.